So we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Free GMAT Prep Hour for November 29th. I'm your host, Avi Gutman. So I'm sure you're all curious to find out what we're going to cover today. And that is going to be verbal reasoning, but specifically sentence correction. I want to explore together with you tonight why sentence correction is in the GMAT, how is it a part of the verbal reasoning section, why does it make sense to have it there, and why is it something that business schools might be interested in testing. So hopefully that's something that you've been wondering about yourselves. We are going to learn, I guess, everything other than grammar tonight. So I don't want to work on grammar. I want to work on the thing that students typically don't think about, right? Everyone thinks, oh, it's a grammar test, sentence correction, it's all about the grammar, master the grammar. And that's true. We do need to learn as much grammar as we can for sentence correction, but grammar isn't enough. And that's really what tonight is about. It's about what else is there besides grammar that can help us in sentence correction. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about what I think verbal reasoning really is. And then from that, we can figure out how to improve our verbal reasoning. So to me, verbal reasoning is figuring out what motivated the author. So this is what we need to do in reading comprehension. Indeed, every reading comprehension passage will have a question that asks, what was the author's primary purpose? Which is another way of asking, what motivated the author to write this text? Critical reasoning, how do we find the conclusion of an argument in critical reasoning? Well, the conclusion is the reason why the author wrote the argument. Right? There's something that motivated the author to write this piece of text. If we can figure out what that was, what motivated the author, then we'll be able to easily identify the conclusion of the argument. Sentence correction is where people really don't think about what motivated the author to write the sentence, and I think if we do consider that, that can really help us speed up and improve our accuracy. So that's what I think verbal reasoning is, and of course we'll explore today how that can be useful in sentence correction. Now, in order to do a good job with verbal reasoning, we have to have this skill of being able to identify the primary purpose of a sentence. So sentence correction is just a sentence, so that's obvious there. But when you go to critical reasoning, and certainly when you go to reading comprehension, if I can't identify the primary purpose of each sentence, there's no way that I'll be able to identify the primary purpose of the whole passage. So I want to start off this session with an exercise. We'll take a reading comprehension passage from the free resources on MBA.com. I won't take the whole passage. It's a very long passage. We'll just take a part of it. And what I'd like to do with all of you here tonight is practice identifying the core of each sentence in this passage. So what we're looking to find is who is doing what in this sentence? What is the subject and what is the verb? And we're just going to go sentence by sentence and see if we can figure it out. Along the way, we're going to learn some tricks to help us identify the core of a sentence in the future. One of those tricks is going to be using the meaning. In other words, if we can identify, forget about grammar for a moment, just from a meaning perspective, why did the author write this sentence? Who do we think is the subject, the thing for which the sentence was written? What is the subject doing? Then I think that can really help us in identifying the subject and the verb. So when I say subject, when I say verb, a lot of people think grammar. And you're right, it is grammar, but try not to think of it as grammar. Try to think of it as verbal reasoning, as meaning. What is the sentence really about? And see if that can help you identify the subject and the verb. So this is the passage. We'll start with the first sentence, so it ends right here. Please put your fingers on your keyboards, and when you're ready, type what you think is the subject and the verb in this sentence. I'll just wait for a couple more people to submit. Okay. So as I think about the common mistake that people would probably make here is probably people would think that the career is the subject. Maybe people would think that the famous British nurse Florence Nightingale is the subject. These are the classic mistakes. I can tell that neither of those is the subject because they have a preposition in front of them. Again, this is starting to sound like a grammar lesson, but I think this is a really important rule. So anything that comes after a preposition, of is the most common preposition, of course. And when you see something coming after the word of, there's no way that that's the subject. I'm going to give you another way to identify that neither of these is the subject. A subject has to have a verb. Is the career doing anything in this sentence? I can't identify a verb that would describe what is the career doing. What is Florence Nightingale doing in this sentence? Nothing. Really, the only verb in this sentence that I can see is the verb offer. So who's doing this offering? Who is offering? These publications, they offer. So there's your subject and there's your verb. Why did the author write this first sentence? To tell us what these two recent publications offer. That's the purpose of the sentence. All right, let's try the second sentence. So starting here, ending at the end of the third line. So it looks like we have some agreement that a book is the subject. If you thought that Anne Summers was the subject, again, we have a preposition leading into Anne Summers, so that is not the subject. The book is the subject. And I think a lot of people are highlighting seeks as the verb. So this is what the book does. Some people are also highlighting present because we have the word and here. And so when you have the word and, that means it's a list of two or more things. And then the word and is followed by a verb. So if we have a verb immediately after the word and, surely that goes together with a verb earlier on. So I can see why people are linking those two verbs together. If you're not seeing a chat box in your Zoom, make sure that you are using the Zoom app as opposed to just a web browser. And in the Zoom app, there should be maybe like a ... that says more with the word more underneath the ... And if you click that, you should see a chat option. If you don't see a chat, it's possible that you're not in the Zoom app, you're just in a web browser or something like that. Can I get some reactions from all of you to this idea of combining seeks and present? Are these two verbs just two items in a list of things or not? What do you think? That's right. You guys are good. So the present goes together with debunk. That's the parallelism here. So seeks to do two things, to debunk and present. How did you know that? How did you know that present doesn't go with seeks? Why can't the book do seeks and present? Why is that not an option? How do you know? Why can't the book seek to do something and also present something? Why can't a book do both of those things? How do we know? Yeah, so you could say the book seeks to present, but couldn't you also just say the book presents? There is a way to prove this, and I'm waiting to see if anyone can identify. How can we tell for sure that present goes with debunk and not with seeks? Trishita, well done. You get 10 points for that. If present was a second item in the list that started here with seeks, then it wouldn't say present, it would say presents with an S in the end. A book seeks and presents, not a book seeks and present. A book seeks to present. Now, I think for most of you, you probably noticed it without noticing it, if that makes sense. Like it happened in the background, and that's why you kept thinking that present goes with debunk. You just couldn't put your finger on it. Well done, Trishita. Okay, next sentence. According to Summers, all the way to this period. What do you think? Subject, verb. Okay, so I'm seeing some good answers. Looks like this was okay. The subject here is the importance. I can tell that the subject is not Summers because that came after a preposition too. I can tell it's not Nightingale because there was an apostrophe S, so this noun is a possessive, it can't be a subject. Something belonging to nightingales might be the subject, and there it is, it's the importance. The importance, what did it do? What about the importance? The importance has been exaggerated. That's the reason the author wrote this sentence. The author wrote this sentence in order to tell us that according to Summers, the importance of Nightingale has been exaggerated. Now I'll show you this next one because it's a bit tricky. This is she did become. So she is the subject, did become is the verb. It's a bit of an odd construction there. What about the next sentence? Additionally, ending here, what's the subject and the verb up to there? Okay. So we have here a subject, Summers, a verb, writes, and then immediately after the verb, we have the word that. So what does this mean? Right after the word that, we're going to have another sentence, another clause, that is going to have its own subject and verb. So we are about to get a new sentence, if you will, that's going to tell us what is this thing that Summers writes. So whatever comes after the that is going to have its own subject and verb. Can we find the subject and the verb for this new clause that comes after the word that? And I'll highlight that it's not the nurses, because that came after the word of. It's not the relief, because that came after the word to, which was also a preposition. It's not the wounded, because they came after the word of. This looks like a verb, was. So what was at best marginal? What was at best marginal? The contribution was at best marginal. Okay, next sentence. So here we're starting to see some disagreement in the chat box. I'm going to tell you what can't be the subject. So military medicine cannot be the subject because of the word of. Army organizational practices cannot be the subject because of the word by. I do have a verb here, were caused. What were caused by army organizational practices? What were caused? Not military medicine. That doesn't even make sense that military medicine were caused by, I mean, it would be was caused, but also how is military medicine caused by army organizational practices? That doesn't make any sense. So this is where we can use logic as well. The problems were caused, the prevailing problems. So the problems is the subject, and the verb is were caused. Now I do have a comma and here, so it looks like I might be starting a new clause again. So it's going to have its own subject and verb. Can you identify for me a subject and a verb here after the word and? Maddie, you're doing really well. You're doing very well at this. So the addition, indeed, is this new subject. Not the nurses, because of the word of in front of that. Not the medical staff, but the to in front of that. The addition is the new subject, and there is the verb. The addition could be. Good. Okay. Last sentence of this paragraph. Give it a shot. This is a little bit tricky. I'm going to highlight Summers asserts because that is in and of itself a subject and a verb. You could rewrite this sentence starting with Summers asserts. You could say Summers asserts that, and then go on to do the rest. So that would be kind of similar to what we saw here. Remember up here with the word that? You could have done the same thing here. Summers asserts that, and then get the new clause that starts over here. So forget about Summers asserts. I already did that one for you. For the other clause going on here, what's the subject and what's the verb? And I see that Maddie again is doing really well as Trishita and TC, well done. The subject is place. It can't be Nightingale because of the apostrophe S again. So we've got Nightingale's place. What about that place? That place is largely due to, and so on. All right. So we have another 2 sentences to go, and then we'll look at some sentence correction problems. So when you're ready, please type the subject and the verb of this sentence here. And I'll remind you, if you have any questions about any of this, please use the Q&A to let me know. Okay, and I'm going to give you another trick here. So sometimes if you're not sure about what the subject is, but you can identify the verb, so here we have a verb, view, ask yourself, do the letters view something? That doesn't make sense. The new volume is viewing something? That doesn't make sense. The editor's view, that can make sense. So the editors view Nightingale as blah, 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 blah. So the editor is its subject. Of course, the other trick you can use is the prepositions. The new volume comes after the preposition of. The letters come after the preposition of, so neither of those can be the subject. The subject is the editors, and the verb is view. Now, someone typed that the subject was the letters and that the verb was influenced. And I think it passes the logic test because letters can influence somebody. I can see how that would make sense. Letters could influence someone. So again, how do I know that letters is not the subject? Notice that letters came after the word of. So that's one way to know that letters is not the subject. The way to know that influenced is not the verb is because we have this modifier in front of it. So who significantly influenced? This verb is going to be part of this modifier that is describing a person. So it's a description of this person. It is not a verb that goes with a subject in the sentence. So if it's helpful to you, you can kind of imagine the word who or which or really anything that starts with WH. You can imagine that as kind of opening up parentheses to describe the thing in front of it. So what kind of person? The kind of person who significantly influenced not only her own age, but also subsequent generations. And so with logic, you can figure out where do the parentheses end. In this case, they end at the period. So all of that part in the parentheses is just there to describe the person. So influenced is not a verb in the sense that it doesn't go with some subject. It's just describing the person. Does that make sense? Robert, I'm looking at your question in the Q&A. Yes, and I think I mentioned it, but I might not have. So Robert is asking about this part. I think this is what you're asking about, Robert. So she is a subject and did become is a verb. That's right. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Does this make sense, how I know that letters is not a subject and influence is not a verb? Okay. Since we're talking about verbal reasoning today, before we go to the very last sentence, I want to highlight something for you. So we've got this kind of idiomatic expression here, not only X, but also Y. And not only her own age, but also subsequent generations. What do you think the author's emphasis is when using this kind of idiom? Is the emphasis on the first part, her own age, or is the emphasis on the second part, the subsequent generations? First part or second part? What do you think? So it looks like intuitively you all sense that the author is emphasizing the second part. Is that always true when we use not only X, but also Y? The emphasis is on the Y? Is that like a thing? Yeah, it is. And that's something that I would call verbal reasoning, because there's a very significant meaning to that idiom, not only X, but also Y. They're not equal, Robert, they're not equal. So when we use not only X, but also Y, the implication is that X, the first part, X, is a well-known fact. Like everybody knows that. That's not surprising. That's not the reason the author is writing it. But also Y. So the Y is the thing that ought to be somewhat surprising. People weren't expecting it. People didn't know it. They knew X. X wasn't surprising. But the Y, that second part, that's really the reason the author is writing the sentence. So it's an interesting idiom in that it has a very specific meaning. Okay. So very last sentence of this passage, what would you say is the subject and what is the verb? Yeah, you guys are doing very well. They is the subject, highlight is the verb, and everything else is just telling us what they highlight. They highlight her ongoing efforts to reform sanitary conditions after the war. Now, someone wrote that the subject is letters. I assume you're still talking about this sentence. So I'll just say this one more time. I was saying that the letters can't be a subject for the reason that they are part of this prepositional phrase starting with the word of. And this is really, I think, probably the best trick to figuring out what's not the subject. If something comes after a preposition, it cannot be the subject of the sentence. And the reason for that is that a preposition is a modifier. It's always there to give us some more information, to describe something. In this case, it's telling us what new volume we're talking about. New volume of what? New volume on its own is nonsensical. What does new volume mean? Oh, new volume of Nightingale's letters. So it's just giving us some more color, some more description on which new volume we're talking about. That's what prepositions do. And so when you come immediately after a preposition, you can't be the subject of the sentence. You're inside a modifier. Does that make sense? So real quick, for those of you who were struggling with this exercise, do you have any ideas on how to improve? How are you going to get better at this? How do you practice this? What are some thoughts? Answering Robert's question, I don't know what a subject noun is. For GMAT purposes, I have to say that it's not a thing because I don't exactly know what a subject noun is. There is one exception to the rule, and that is quantity descriptions. So let me just show you the exception. And after I show you the exception, I can really confidently say, if it's inside a prepositional phrase, it's not a subject. So here's the exception. If I say 1/3 of the students did really well. Okay, so the verb in this sentence is did, and the subject in this sentence is the students. Even though we have the preposition in front of it. So why does this exception exist? Because it's describing a quantity, 1/3 of the students. So 1/3 on its own doesn't really make sense as the subject. You could probably say more accurately that the subject is this whole thing. And I wonder if maybe this is what you meant, Robert, as a subject phrase. So you could say that whole thing that I highlighted in pink is the subject. But if you had to kind of narrow it down to a single word, what is the subject here? The subject is students, even though it came after a preposition. So that's kind of an exception to the rule. But that's the only exception I'm aware of. Other than that, other than the description of quantity, where you're saying 1/3 of, 20% of, all of, some of, most of, etc. So except for those, if you're inside a prepositional phrase, you're not the subject. But I do think you might have been referring to this as a subject phrase, Robert. And if so, then yes, you're correct. Now, Kabbana is saying, look for the big picture, maybe. So that's in response to my question about how you're going to practice this at home. I think you're right. We want to look for the big picture in every sentence, and that's going to guide us to the core of the sentence, because the core of the sentence is going to be to go hand in hand with a big picture. I think another good exercise might be to just search for prepositions, right? Take a passage. It could even be a reading comprehension passage from the GMAT, and just highlight all of the prepositions. So the words like of, to, by, in, under. There's a list of common prepositions in the sentence correction strategy guide. So I would suggest taking that list, taking a passage, and just searching for prepositions so that you get good at noticing them. So that's a good exercise to do if you keep falling into this trap of picking out something inside a preposition and thinking that that's the subject. Okay, so let's move on. Let's look at how we can actually use this in sentence correction. How is sentence correction exactly testing this? So it is possible to eliminate a lot of answer choices in sentence correction just using grammar, but it's not possible to eliminate 4 answer choices just using grammar. Maybe on easier questions it is, but as the questions get harder, you'll find yourself narrowing it down to 2 or even 3 remaining answer choices that appear grammatically correct. I mean, you could be a grammar expert and still say, hey, there's 2 or 3 answer choices here that are grammatically okay. And what they're testing there is verbal reasoning. So one of the sentences will be grammatically correct but have redundancy. Or one of the sentences will be grammatically correct but nonsensical. Or one of the sentences will be grammatically correct but the emphasis won't make sense. In other words, we're reading the sentence and we're thinking, I know why the author wrote this. I know what should be emphasized here. But I'm looking at this sentence, and what should be emphasized is a modifier in this answer choice. And what should be a modifier is the core in this answer choice. Well, that doesn't make sense. That misses the point. That's not why the author wrote the sentence. So how can we tell why the author wrote the sentence? We have to use verbal reasoning. We have to use logic. We have to try to put ourselves in the author's shoes and figure out what motivated the author to write this sentence. And I'm sure some of you have noticed questions where you look at the answer choices and they're moving around, they're shifting. What was the core in this answer is actually the modifier in this answer, and vice versa. And you're like, that's weird. What are they doing here? Well, I'll tell you what they're doing. They're testing verbal reasoning. Those answers are probably grammatically fine, both of them. And really the way to choose between them is to use verbal reasoning. Now, the other thing that verbal reasoning will help you with is eliminate answer choices more quickly. So in other words, even if you can use grammar to eliminate answer choices, it's probably true that you would eliminate them much quicker using verbal reasoning than using grammar, at least some of the time. So that's what I want to kind of explore with you on these next few sentence correction questions. So I'll give you some time to try it on your own. But keep asking yourself, what motivated the author to write this sentence? What should the author emphasize here? And then see if that is helpful to you in eliminating answer choices. So we're not focusing on grammar right now. We're focusing on meaning, and we'll see if we can eliminate some answer choices. I'm going to give you another 20 seconds or so. You can keep working on it. But what I'd like you to start thinking about is finding the core of the sentence. So we're looking for the subject and the verb of the sentence. Please type those as well in the chat box when you're ready. Okay, looks like some of you thought the verb was equalize. So that can't possibly be the verb, and I'll tell you why. You see this here and immediately before it, the word to. So we know the word to from that passage. It was a preposition. So we learned that you won't have a subject after a preposition. We also learned you won't have a verb inside a modifier. Remember we had who. We had the modifier who, blah, blah, blah. There was a verb in there, and we said, well, that's not the verb because it's inside a modifier. In this case, when you have to verb, you don't really need to know what it's called, but I'll tell you anyway. This is called an infinitive. And an infinitive, so to verb, to sleep, to drink, to eat, to equalize, is never a verb. An infinitive is not a verb. So this is not the verb. You were correct, those of you who said that efforts is the subject. And if you just ask yourself what motivated the author to write this sentence, like why is the author telling us this whole sentence? I think you'll all agree the author wrote this in order to tell us something disappointing about the efforts. Did the efforts achieve the aim? Were the efforts successful or unsuccessful? Does that help those of you who couldn't find the verb earlier find the verb? What do these efforts do? Is that helpful? So I think there are two takeaways here. One is the thing about an infinitive. So an infinitive is never a verb. And two is you got to ask yourself, but what motivated the author to write this thing? There's a reason why the author wrote this. And you're right, the verb is reduced, although it's not just reduced, it's has. It's has reduced. And we have the not significantly in there as well. Those two words are very important for verbal reasoning. That's where I'm getting the disappointment. Right? The author is disappointed by something, and the author's disappointment is what motivated him or her to write the sentence. So where did I get the disappointment? That's from those two words. So they're very important words, but they're not part of the verb technically. The verb is has reduced. Now, does that make sense? Efforts, plural, has reduced, singular. Does that make sense? So when we focus on what motivated the author to write this, we can eliminate three answer choices very, very quickly. And this is what I meant when I said focusing on verbal reasoning, wondering what motivated the author to write this? What is the author's primary purpose in writing this sentence? Can really help us eliminate the answers very quickly. Now, I want you to look at the remaining two answer choices and maybe focus on the gap versus the gaps. How can we tell whether the gap should be singular or plural? Any thoughts on that? This is almost turning into a quantitative reasoning question instead of a verbal reasoning question. Should it be singular gap or plural gaps? All right, so some of you are saying, well, the efforts is plural, therefore the gaps should be plural as well to match the efforts. Others are saying it should be plural because we have plural districts. So here we have plural districts, therefore gaps should be plural. Somebody else said we have plural efforts, therefore the gaps should be plural. So all of you, I guess, would pick E. Any other thoughts? I think somebody there said it should be singular gap. Why? I think Maddie and Trishita, again, are the winners of this. It should be singular, and Maddie and Trishita kind of are hitting the reason, which is that, well, how many gaps are there between the richest district and the poorest district? How many gaps are there between the richest and the poorest district? Only one gap. I'm thinking about it from a quantitative reasoning standpoint or even integrated reasoning standpoint. You've got you've got a graph where all the districts are kind of somewhere on that graph. You've got the poorest one, you've got the richest one, and you're looking at the gap between them. It's a single gap. It's not multiple gaps. We're just comparing one district to another district, the richest district to the poorest district. So those of you who were leaning towards E, where your reasoning was districts is plural, so gaps should be plural, or efforts is plural, so gaps should be plural, I think that you're a little bit too robotic in your approach. Does that make sense? I'm not saying it as an insult. I'm saying it as a fact. You're not being thoughtful enough about what the author is trying to convey. You're just looking for something that matches. Oh, there's a plural word, I should go with plural. There's a plural word, I should go with plural. But you're not thinking about what is the actual gap or gaps that we're talking about here. So I think that that's an important takeaway, is to try to be a little bit more thoughtful about what the gap or gaps represent. What are we actually talking about? And I think there might be something else going on here. Let me know in the chat box. Please don't be shy. Let me know if you're one of those people who just kind of stop reading at the end of the underline. So in other words, you're not really reading the blue part. Or maybe you're reading the blue part, but you're not really paying attention. You're a little bit zoned out by the time you get to that non-underlined text at the end of the sentence. Does anyone do that? I'm not seeing anyone confess. Come on, fess up. Maybe this is a particularly good group of students. Well, either way, I think an important takeaway here is that the non-underlined text that comes at the end of a sentence is often the most important thing on the computer screen. They'll often put in some hints there, as they did here, right? When we read that part and think about it, we realize it's a singular gap. Now, someone in the chat box said, wait, between richest and poorest, there would be multiple gaps, no? And my answer is no. So let's imagine, let's do a thought experiment. So say there's a class of students, and they all have different amounts of money in their pockets, okay? And I want to rank them from richest to poorest. And then I want to know what's the difference between the amount of money the richest student has and the amount of money the poorest student has. So in other words, I'm looking for the gap between the money that the richest student has and the money that the poorest student has. That's a single gap. It's one gap between the richest and the poorest. Does that answer your question, Al? Al? Okay. And I'm seeing some other comments looking at other issues with the answer choices. I'm not going to go into any of that today because that's not the point of this session. The point of this session is just to find quick ways to eliminate answer choices using verbal reasoning. And I hope that you'll agree that in this case, we eliminated ABC very quickly, and then we can also eliminate E fairly quickly if we are being thoughtful about what the author is trying to convey here. If the author is trying to convey the gap, and by the way, everyone, maybe overall the gaps have shrunk, have been reduced, but the gap between the richest and the poorest district has not been reduced. Okay, so so if it was a critical reasoning question, that's what we would then say. We would say, well, there were efforts to equalize the funds, and you, the author, is saying those efforts were, you're implying that the efforts were no good because the gap between the richest and the poorest was not significantly reduced. And then the counter argument is, but maybe all the other districts are much more equal than they were. So maybe the efforts were somewhat successful. So just as we have to be thoughtful about the text, the meaning in critical reasoning, I think we should try to be just as thoughtful in sentence correction because that can help us eliminate answer choices very quickly. Sorry, just reading the chat box. So I'm not going to go into the other issues. Should the non-underlined. Robert, I'm not sure that I'm understanding your question. Should the non-underlined part be district between the richest and the poorest district? Oh, I see. So you're saying, hey, shouldn't this be singular? I see what you're saying. No, so you could say between the richest district and the poorest district, singular and singular. So that you could do that, that's an option. If you're skipping the district here, the first district, and you're just putting the word district in the end, well, now it's not a singular district. Now you've got the richest and the poorest districts. Now it's two districts, the richest district and the poorest district together, that's districts, plural. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question. This is why I didn't want to go into other differences in the answer choices. This is not a grammar lesson. It's just a verbal reasoning lesson. So let's go ahead and try this one. Okay, so what I'd like to ask you all for this one is see if you can identify a verbal reasoning issue that 4 of the answer choices have. There's a way here to eliminate 4 answer choices for 1 verbal reasoning issue. Can anyone identify it? Why not, Maddie? Good. Well done. We have redundancy. The word continue is a very important word. What does that word imply? Good. Good. So if it already implies that something is ongoing and has already been happening, then to say in addition, and notice that all of them have continue. This is something all of the answer choices have. So if you're already using the word continue, why would you then also say that something has already been happening? Kabana, do you see that? You see why I can eliminate A, B, C, D? They're all redundant because the word continue already means that something has already been happening. So then there's no need to also say that this has already been happening. That's already implied in the word continue. You can eliminate 4 answer choices. There's another verbal reasoning issue going on here, but only in the first 2 answer choices. Can anyone identify that for me? From a verbal reasoning perspective, what's wrong with A and B? Subject-verb agreement is okay, actually, because the subject that goes with have been is reports. That's plural, so that's okay. Robert, in the meantime, can you type up in your own words in the chat box what the word continue means? Just in your own words. What does the word continue imply? Maddie, what's wrong with the verb tense in A and B? I think you might be onto it. So Robert, what you wrote is very good, but I'm asking, what does the word continue imply? So what you're telling me is the kind of the definition of the word continue. But the word continue also has an implication, something that's kind of unstated. You're right that it implies no change. Take that a little bit further, Robert. So if I say that I am going to continue to drink heavily today, what's the implication there? That's right, Robert. I drank heavily yesterday and probably I've been drinking heavily every day for a while. But at least yesterday. So it's not just that I'm going to continue to drink heavily today, I must have also drank heavily yesterday. So it doesn't make sense for me to say I'm going to continue to drink heavily today as I have been yesterday, or as I did yesterday, or as I have for a week. I guess if I say as I have been for a week, then at least I'm adding some more information. I'm telling you how long I've been doing it for. But answer choices A, B, C, D don't even tell us how long it's been going on. So then why say anything at all? Like it doesn't, why are you telling me that you've already been doing it? I already know you've already been doing it because you used the word continue. If you're using the word continue, then I already know that you've been doing it. So if you're going to tell me I've been doing it for 10 days, okay, I can see why you would tell me that. That's adding information. But if you're just saying I've been doing it already, well, I already knew you've been doing it already because you used the word continue. And Maddie got it for A and B. The have part is wrong in A and B because have is past, and the structure of this sentence is a conditional. If so-and-so happens, then this will happen. So let me give you a kind of a nonsensical sentence to show you why A and B are wrong. So imagine if I said, if it rains tomorrow, I washed my car this morning. Do you see that? Do you see why that's nonsensical? We're saying if something happens, then something already happened. I mean, as long as time travel doesn't exist, as long as you haven't invented a time machine, the verb tense in A and B is nonsensical in the context of a conditional sentence. We're saying if something happens, then something already happened. That doesn't make sense. Exactly, Robert. The have been or as they have already, all of those are redundant in the context of continue. Does that clarify it for you? Awesome. All right, so to wrap this up, I have some takeaways here. Bilal, I'm not sure when the session will be uploaded on YouTube. It usually takes a few weeks. So hopefully by the end of the year, it'll be on YouTube. But it's not up to me, so I don't know exactly when. Thinking about what motivated the author to write the sentence is often very useful in sentence correction. If you haven't already been doing this in reading comp and critical reasoning, do it there as well. It's very, very important to be mindful, to be thoughtful about what motivated the author to write this text. Where people tend to not do that is sentence correction, and I think that's a mistake. I think we should do it in sentence correction as well, because sentence correction is part of the verbal reasoning section. So we talked about the importance of this skill. It's important not just for sentence correction. I mean, if you can't identify why a sentence was written, you won't be able to do critical reasoning or reading comprehension either. It's just a very important skill. We talked about how you might try to practice that at home, kind of doing a similar exercise to what we did today. Okay, and as we saw, the non-underlined text is often the most important thing on the computer screen. And finally, look out for meaning errors. That was a beauty, the last question we looked at, where you can eliminate 4 answer choices because of that redundancy. And I'll just mention the fact that one answer choice didn't talk about the past is a hint. Because when you see that answer choice E, the correct answer, you have to ask yourself, oh, this one doesn't mention that it's been going for a while. Do we need it to mention that it's been going for a while? Is it okay to not mention? And then you realize, well, if he's using the word continue, then it's implied that it's been going on for a while. So the other 4 answer choices are redundant. And you might not have realized that had you not seen answer choice E. So use that, right? When you see one answer choice that's kind of different, ask yourself, well, so how is it different? Why is it different? And is this difference important? All right, so I hope you found this useful. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday evening. And I will be doing this again, I think it's a week from Tuesday. So that one will be about quantitative reasoning. I'm going to do some problem solving, some data sufficiency there. So if you're around, hope to see you there. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.